In this next video tutorial, we're going to look at file and project management basics, a couple tricks that you can do to organize the stuff that you're working on so you don't get confused by it, and if something goes south while you're working, which can happen sometimes, you don't lose all your work and you can get right back to where you were. I'm going to switch into top mode real fast and scooch this default cube that we end up with over to the right a bit, and then I'm going to add a new mesh cube so that we have two of them, and maybe I'll push it over to the right a little bit too. Now, when we have two objects, all of a sudden our world becomes a little more complicated to organize. The first thing I think makes sense to do as you start to grow a model file is to start naming things so that you can pull them up in the outliner over here on the right and know which object you're working with. Of course, with only two objects, it doesn't matter too much, but if you imagine that you have 100 in there, it could get complicated really fast. So to rename an object in Blender, you want to select the object that you're interested in, either in the outliner or in the main 3D viewport, and then click on the Object tab over here so that you can give it a new name. It might make sense if you're dealing with primitives and planning on keeping them in those basic shapes to leave them called cube, maybe cube.1 or cube big, or if you're going to actually make it into a part that you know you're going to have, you could name it something descriptive for that. And then you might want to name the next piece too. So we'll go ahead and select that and give it a name. And maybe this will become a rocket. So we'll call it rocket. So now, looking in our outliner, if we pull this down a bit, it's really easy for me to grab either the rocket or the tower just by name. Okay, the next thing I want to show you is after you have your elements named on the page, another trick you can do to organize is to use layers. The layers show up down here on the bottom, and by clicking on a different square within the available layers, it will show you that layer. As you can see, these two objects are currently sitting on layer 1. If I want to move one of these objects to a new layer in order to organize things, I can just hit the space bar and type in layer and then select move to layer. That's an easy way to remember how to do this. You'll see it also gives you the hotkey M, which if you want to remember that, you could do it in the future. So I'll click on move to layer and then I get a series of layers to choose from. Let's move this one to layer 2. Now we're done, and of course we don't see it because we're looking at layer 1. So to see the second object now, if we click on the second layer, we can view that. You can also shift select multiple layers, and now we're looking at layer 1 and layer 2. This object is on layer 2, this one's on layer 1, and we're seeing both of them. Let's go ahead and hide that one and hide this one, actually the second one, and we'll take our object here and move it to layer again. And now we can move it back to the first layer. And by doing that, now we have moved an object twice between two layers, and we can go back to viewing just the first layer, and we'll see that they're both back where we started. So as models get really complicated, you can use layers to say, for example, put all of the objects of a certain type on one layer and your background on the second layer, and maybe elements that are in between the two on a third layer, and that helps you to organize your things as your models become more complex. Okay, now that we're basically comfortable naming objects and being able to select them in the outliner by name or in the viewport, and moving them around between different layers, let's go ahead and look at how to save these files so we don't lose too much work if our Blender crashes or we mess up the file somehow and get stuck. File, save, will save your Blender file, and it prompts you with a location to save it. You can notice that you've got some bookmarks to quickly accessible areas over here on the left, or you have a list of recent documents where you've saved things. You can also type in directly the path up here in the top to where you want to save it. I'm currently selected into a good folder, so I'm just going to save. Now the trick is to give it a name and leave the .blend suffix on the end of the file. So this is a demo, and I could just call it demo3, for example, and say save. That's the basics of saving, but let me give a couple little tricks too. When you're working, you can pull up save right away by hitting the space bar and typing in save Blender file. You'll notice that it's also Command S, which you can use as a hotkey to jump to save right away. One last thing, I like to save as periodically, where you give your file a new name. So since I started calling it demo3 to begin with, I'm going to call it demo4 now and say save as Blender file. What's nice about that is now I have two versions saved, version 3 and version 4. So if I wanted to keep working on this, I could work on it for a while longer and save version 5, version 6, version 7, and eventually that way if I come back a couple days later and I realize that I really would have liked to have branched off and gone a different direction with my project a couple versions earlier, it's easy for me to go and find out which version to pick based on the numbers.